Hello everybody, this is Yasmin from Yarkspiri fantasyart.com. Today I'm actually working on a centaur drawing. I've never actually drawn a centaur before, so I had to do a lot of reference. I've actually never drawn a horse, to be honest. It's been years since I even attempted to do that. So as I was actually drawing this piece, I was actually learning how to properly structure and pose a horse at the same time. So I was looking at quite a bit of reference once again. So I had a couple of different books that I had open when I was actually doing this. The main book for the posing that I used was a book by, I'm probably going to say his name wrong, Ken Hogan. And it's called The Art of Animal Drawing, Construction, Action Analysis, and Caricature. Now this is really good for figuring out how to actually pose out most of these animals that are actually featured in this book. So I did learn quite a bit about horse anatomy through that. But in order to actually understand how the bone structure was properly structured, although this reference did have quite a good deal of good reference in it, I did have to see my more detailed book on animal anatomy. So for this, I actually used a different reference. So for the actual anatomy of the actual horse, in order to understand it properly, I was switching between two references. The second reference was Encyclopedia Anatomica, and this book was by, once again, I think I'm going to missay it, Gorgi Fiher? I'm pretty sure I missaid it, and I do apologize. And it is a very good book, though, because it actually shows you the comparison between human anatomy and animal anatomy. And that's really useful, especially for animals like this, where there's a portion that is human, but the rest of it is, of course, an animal. Human anatomy is actually very similar to animal anatomy, believe it or not. In most cases, the only difference is that certain limbs are either shortened or elongated, depending on the structure. So when it comes to a horse structurally, they're actually standing on their fingernails. So those hooves are actually fingernails, or the equivalent of fingernails for us. So they're actually stepping on the very tips of their toes, which is quite interesting, because in order to actually understand how it's like fully structured, you would actually have to compare each of the limbs in order to understand how they're actually structured fully. So yes, in this case, there would be certain bones that would be severely shortened to the point of almost non-existing, and certain ones would be elongated to the extreme in order to give this different anatomy. Let's say we took elephants, for example. Elephants actually stand on the pads of their fingers. So rather than the nail being the main portion that they're actually putting all their weight on, it's actually the fingertips that they're actually standing on, which is really interesting, because once you understand generally how anatomy works, both human and animal, you can cross-apply this information. Now, why was this useful? Okay, this was useful for this drawing for a couple of reasons. For me, it was understanding how the spinal cord of the horse portion would actually connect to the centaur. Now, obviously, this is a steampunk version, so the bottom portion is actually mechanical, but the same principles would apply, because you need to understand how that spinal cord would be supported properly within that structure in order to be able to draw it. So this is where books that actually compare human anatomy and animal anatomy, and that are very detailed in that regard, become extremely useful, is that you can see how these functions can overlap and how you can mix and match different animals together to get a different effect. So I do use that knowledge, that base knowledge that I have on human anatomy in order to work out my creature drawings. Because I already have the fundamental, I already understand how to break down structure and how it would apply to a given character. So as you see, I did take quite a while for the general structure for this. Once again, it's a very detailed piece, so I did have to go in and make sure I had all the detail figured out. so that it would be easier for me to paint in the proper structure and the proper forms. Because as, especially this type of character, the way he's standing, the perspective is actually very important in the structure. Anything mechanical will have, you should be paying attention more to the structure and the perspective that is around the character, because it will be heavily influenced by both. So that's the reason why I had to take a great deal of time in order to actually figure out structurally how this character was going to actually be composed. So once I figured out the general structure of the character, as you can see, I just roughed in the basic shadows and the basic background. Now, I did do quite a few changes on the background for this character later on, but for the majority, I just worked on the character, especially for this one, because the character is so detailed, and it is, once again, a focal point. It's more of a detailed illustration or concept at this point, because I'm focusing so much on the character design. I'm not really focused that much on the background, although it is very important in general to work on the background as well. So as you can see, I'm just making sure that some of the details read correctly before I spend too much time. Once again, I mostly used the soft round brush for almost all of this. The only time I actually started switching brushes was when I wanted to actually add textures to the background and the character itself. I don't normally find that it's all that necessary to worry about specializing with a very specific brush. You can normally take the default brushes that Photoshop comes with and just modify them to whatever you need to use it for. Now I do have specialty brushes that I've downloaded. All those brushes that I use are the same ones that Darkin uses on his videos. He has, I do have to admit, Darkin does have really good artwork, so if you ever do get a chance to look it up. But I'll be honest, once again, the brushes really don't make a huge difference. There's several ways that you could apply texture to a character, and texture isn't needed. If you have very good structure, if you have the shapes read correctly, you don't need the extra detail. It's nice to have the extra detail, but it won't cover up mistakes that you've done. So that's why it's really good to focus on the general structure of a character, the general design, the perspective. All of that is extremely important and is way more beneficial to the overall design than any amount of detail. It's actually quite interesting because if you take your favorite artists out there and you break it down and you discover that they don't have very good structure within their character, or they don't have smooth lines or good actions to their character, it reads on their drawing. And if you do corrections to those drawings, you'll see how much better those pieces look just by adding that structure to it. So structure is the base on which you should be working on. You can add the details after. They don't take as long, but until you actually have the structure down and you understand how to do the perspective properly, it doesn't matter how much detail you add, it won't look good. And also, if you add a lot of structure and a really good professional takes a look at it, they can tell immediately whether or not you understand the fundamentals. Whereas somebody who is a novice, who doesn't fully understand the structure yet, it shows very strongly in their drawings. And you can normally tell somebody who's very professional and very good at what they do simply by comparing the structure and the techniques that they used in their drawing. When I actually used the tutor, there was a young gentleman who brought me one of his favorite drawings that he really loved. And it didn't have all that much detail to it. However, it had a very interesting pose, which the artist did have a lot going for that drawing. However, it was as if the artist took the character and just stretched them out. There was no bone structure within that character, and the general structure of the clothing were not sufficient enough to support the actual drawing, which was unfortunate too, because the artist did originally have a really beautiful piece, but because they didn't understand structure or how things wrapped around the form, it showed severely in their drawing. So what I did as an example is I just took his favorite drawing, and just for a small portion of that character, I added some structure. I just added some, made sure that the clothes were wrapping around the character properly. I just made sure that the neck was properly structured. I didn't have to change the pose. I just enhanced it by adding proper structure. Now, for most people, they have difficulty doing a really unique pose along with structure. Structure does tend to stiffen out a drawing and make it lose fluidity. There's a couple of workarounds on that. It's how you work with your drawing that will determine whether or not it's very fluid, has a lot of life to it, it has a lot of motion, versus something that has a lot of structure. My drawings do tend to have a lot more structure to them because that is my main focus when I draw. However, when I'm doing the pre-stages for my drawings, in order to keep myself from only concentrating on the structure, I normally work just with silhouettes, just with lines, basic lines, so that I can get a really nice strong posture first. Because once again, you want it to still keep that fluidity that you really liked in the piece and not lose that, because that's the part that you liked. So it's a fine balance between structure and having a very fluid drawing. It's a very hard line to tread sometimes, but if you can get that happy medium between both, you'll notice that your drawings turn out a lot better. So your workflow will change depending on which one you tend to lean towards. I know I tend to lean towards very structured drawings. So my initial stages would be different than somebody who had very fluid, loose drawings, great postures, or a lot of emotion to it. What I do is, because I'm starting off on a drawing, is because I know I tend to do that, is I'll work just with lines, once again, just with silhouettes. And what I initially used to do is I would only work with black and white. By doing that, it forced me to look at the silhouette and how the character was moving versus just the structure. That's just one of many techniques that can be used in order to figure out the proper posing of the character. Now, I did a lot of changes on this background because, once again, I do focus on structure a lot, and perspective is one of those things I try to focus on. So, although you see me doing all the coloring now for the character, I did do a lot of changes later on that I didn't record. They only took about maybe half an hour to do. They were just modifying what I already had done. So you just see me working on the shadows now, adding the colors within that and within the character. So this is the finished drawing. I did do quite a few changes on that background, as you could see. There is quite a few differences. I added some detail to the background, made sure that the perspective was a little bit more correct. The perspective is technically still wrong on this. I didn't spend enough time figuring out the perspective beforehand, and it does show in my drawing. However, I do like the character a lot, so I might just redo the background later on when I have a little bit more time. So thank you for watching, and I hope to see you guys soon. Thank you and take care.